There is radioactive material buried beneath bombed-out Iranian nuclear sites right now. Not destroyed, not removed, just sitting there, deep underground. And according to President Trump, Iran cannot get it out without help from the United States or China. Iran agreed to let it be extracted, then took it back. And somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, on Air Force One, Trump just told the world exactly why that matters, and what he said about China's role in this war is unlike anything we've heard so far. This is May 15th, 2026. President Trump has just departed Beijing following a face-to-face summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the most consequential diplomatic meeting of this conflict so far. On board Air Force One, speaking directly to reporters, Trump laid out the state of the U.S.-Iran war in terms that were blunt, specific, and at times contradictory. Xi Jinping told Trump he would not provide military equipment to Iran. Trump called it a big statement. And Xi expressed a desire to see the Strait of Hormuz reopened, as China draws roughly 40% of its oil through that corridor. But here's what wasn't supposed to come out yet. Iran put forward a new peace proposal. Trump read the first sentence, threw it away. And now, between a partial ceasefire no one seems to fully own, a blockade Trump says is winning the war, and nuclear debris no one can clean up, we're left with a conflict that looks paused, but is nowhere close to finished. If you want fast, fact-based coverage of the Iran conflict without the noise, hit subscribe now, because every hour this story moves in a new direction. Picture the scene. Air Force One, somewhere between Beijing and Washington. Trump sitting across from reporters at 35,000 feet, speaking in real time about a war still actively in progress. He confirmed that during his meeting with Xi Jinping at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, the two leaders had an extensive discussion about Iran. Xi pledged not to supply military equipment to Tehran and offered to personally help broker a resolution to the conflict, telling Trump, "If I can be of any help at all, I would like to be of help." That sentence alone is worth stopping on. China, which has maintained economic ties with Iran for years, now has its most powerful leader, publicly, at least privately to Trump, distancing from Tehran militarily. That is a shift. But Trump's response was equally revealing. When asked whether he needed Xi's help reopening the Strait of Hormuz, Trump said, "I'm not asking for any favors, because when you ask for favors, you have to do favors in return." He added, "We don't need favors. We've wiped out their armed forces, essentially." That's the American position as of this morning. Iran's military, in Trump's assessment, is effectively neutralized. The U.S. blockade on Iranian ports is described by Trump as so effective that it's the primary reason a ceasefire was even offered. Now let's talk about that ceasefire, because this is where the story gets complicated. Trump told reporters he personally would not have been in favor of the ceasefire, but implemented it as a favor to other nations. His exact words, "We really did the ceasefire at the request of other nations. I wouldn't have really been in favor of it, but we did it as a favor to Pakistan." Pakistan, the article notes, has served as a key mediator in negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Think about what that means. The sitting American president is telling reporters mid-flight that the ceasefire his administration agreed to was not something he wanted. It was a diplomatic concession, a favor, and he's now publicly signaling that the clock on that concession is running. Trump referenced a little month-long ceasefire and said, "We may have to do a little cleanup work in a war." That phrase is deliberate vagueness, and it's the kind of language that keeps military analysts, diplomats, and foreign ministries awake at night. Then came the nuclear piece. Trump revealed that Iran's latest peace proposal was rejected because it didn't provide adequate guarantees about their nuclear program. Trump said he read the first sentence and threw it away. When pressed on the specifics, he said Iran had agreed to no nuclear activity, but the guarantees weren't strong enough. It's got to be a real 20 years, he told reporters, as opposed to a 20-year commitment without verifiable enforcement. And then the detail that changes the nature of this entire conversation. Trump disclosed the existence of what he called nuclear dust, enriched uranium stockpiles buried beneath Iranian nuclear facilities that were struck by U.S. forces. He said Iran told him directly that they do not have the equipment to remove it. And according to Trump, Iranian officials stated that only China or the United States possesses the technology and machinery capable of extracting it. Iran agreed to the extraction, then reversed that agreement. That material is still there, underground, unverified. Iran once agreed to let its buried nuclear material be removed by the US or China, then backed out. That reversal may be the single most consequential detail in this entire negotiation, and almost no one is talking about it. Let's zoom out for a moment, because what we're actually watching is a realignment of power across three of the world's most consequential nations, simultaneously, in real time. Start with China. Xi Jinping gets approximately 40% of China's oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is currently under a U.S. military blockade, which means every day it stays closed, China's energy supply chain is under pressure. That isn't a minor inconvenience. For the world's second largest economy, it is a structural vulnerability, and Xi knows it. That vulnerability is part of why Xi told Trump he wants the strait open. Not because he's doing the U.S. a favor, because China's economy depends on it. The question analysts are now asking is this: does Xi's self-interest become a lever that actually moves Tehran? And if China quietly pressures Iran to return to negotiations, does that accelerate a deal? Or does Iran resist any perception that it's bending to Chinese pressure? Now look at the broader military picture. Trump says the U.S. has essentially wiped out Iran's armed forces. That's a presidential assertion, not an independently verified military assessment. But if even a portion of that claim is accurate, it describes an Iran that is militarily degraded, economically strangled by blockade, cut off from its primary military backer, and sitting on top of nuclear material it cannot remove and hasn't fully agreed to relinquish. That combination, military degradation, economic isolation, nuclear ambiguity, is precisely the kind of unstable condition that makes ceasefire periods dangerous rather than calming. Do you think the situation ends in a negotiated deal, or does military pressure resume? Drop your read in the comments. This audience has been consistently ahead of the mainstream narrative on this one. Meanwhile, over in Lebanon, a parallel front is stirring. The IDF reported Friday that it struck Hezbollah infrastructure in the Tyre area of southern Lebanon after rockets were launched toward the Kiryat Shmona area. The IDF said it destroyed the launcher used in the attack along with several structures used by Hezbollah for military purposes. This matters specifically because Hezbollah is, as the article notes, directly backed by Iran. An active ceasefire with Tehran does not automatically translate to quiet in southern Lebanon, and rocket fire from Hezbollah-held territory into Israeli civilian areas is exactly the kind of incident that can unravel diplomatic momentum fast. Notably, representatives from Israel and Lebanon were meeting in Washington on Friday, the same day the IDF struck Hezbollah, for talks aimed at resolving their conflict. Rockets flying north, diplomats talking south, both happening simultaneously. That contradiction, diplomatic progress and active military exchange running on parallel tracks, is not a sign of stability. It's a sign of a conflict that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Here is what almost no headline captured today. Iran told Trump's team that the only countries with the technology to remove their buried nuclear material are the United States and China. That's an extraordinary admission. It means Tehran is not just sitting on nuclear debris, it's sitting on debris it is physically dependent on its adversaries to clean up. And when Iran agreed to allow that removal, then reverse course, it handed both Washington and Beijing a leverage point Neither would have engineered on purpose. The buried material becomes a bargaining chip, not a weapon, a negotiating anchor. And whoever controls access to its removal now has real power over what a final deal looks like. That detail has barely broken through the news cycle. It should be the center of it. Wars are measured in headlines. They are lived in hours. Think about what the past month has looked like for ordinary people caught inside this conflict's orbit. Iranian families in cities where military infrastructure was struck by American forces. Sailors and port workers along Iran's coastline, where U.S. naval blockade operations have strangled inbound and outbound shipping. Fuel shortages, goods delays, commerce frozen. The blockade Trump describes as so effective is effective precisely because it cuts the lifelines of an economy. Food imports, medical supplies, industrial goods, all of it moves through ports. All of it slows when a blockade is in place. In Lebanon, the human cost took a specific form overnight. Rockets were fired from Hezbollah-controlled territory toward the Kiryat Shmona area in northern Israel. Kiryat Shmona is a city, not a military installation, a city. And rockets aimed at a city means sirens, people diving for cover, children being pulled from sleep in the middle of the night and rushed into shelters. The IDF responded with strikes in southern Lebanon's Tyre area. Structures used by Hezbollah, the IDF said. But southern Lebanon is also home to civilian populations who have spent years watching their towns become staging grounds for a conflict they didn't choose. That human texture, the people inside these headlines, is what makes the diplomatic back and forth in Washington and Beijing so consequential. Because every day a deal isn't reached is another day that gap between ceasefire and actual peace stays open. Now think about China's population for a moment. China draws roughly 40% of its oil from routes that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That means the blockade and the broader conflict isn't just an American foreign policy story. It's an energy security story for 1.4 billion people. Every manufacturing plant, every delivery vehicle, every household in China that depends on fuel is indirectly tied to whether this strait reopens or stays blocked. Xi Jinping arriving at this negotiation and saying, "I would like to be of help," is not altruism. It is the voice of a leader whose domestic stability is partially indexed to what happens in a waterway 7,000 kilometers from Beijing. That context reframes Xi's role entirely. He's not a neutral mediator. He's a stakeholder with urgent economic incentives, and Trump appears to understand that perfectly. "I think automatically he'd like to see it opened up," Trump told reporters. He gets about 40% of his energy or his oil from that. Trump's public acknowledgement of China's energy dependence on the strait isn't diplomatic courtesy. It's leverage being flagged out loud, a signal to Xi, "We understand your interests. Make sure Tehran understands them too." And there's Pakistan, a country that rarely enters the center of Middle East analysis, but has now been publicly named by a U.S. president as the reason a ceasefire exists. Trump said the ceasefire was implemented as a favor to Pakistan, which has served as a key mediator in negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Pakistan's role here is quietly significant. Islamabad has historically maintained diplomatic contact with Tehran, even as it navigated its own complex relationship with Washington. For Pakistan to be named as the primary requester of the ceasefire suggests back-channel negotiations at a depth that hasn't yet fully surfaced in public reporting. Who is Pakistan talking to in Tehran? What did they promise? And what do they expect to receive in return? Those questions don't have confirmed answers yet. They may for weeks. Meanwhile, the people living inside all of this, in Tehran, in Kiryat Shmona, in Beirut suburbs, in Chinese port cities, in Pakistani diplomatic halls, are all watching the same uncertain sky, waiting to find out what the next decision means for them. Trump said the U.S. may have to do a little cleanup work once the ceasefire window closes. He didn't define what that means militarily. Iran's nuclear material is still underground. Iran backed out of an agreement to remove it. The Strait of Hormuz is still blocked. Hezbollah is still firing rockets, and Israel is still striking southern Lebanon on the same day its diplomats sit down in Washington. Every single one of those threads is still live. The ceasefire is not a resolution. It's a pause with a time signature nobody has publicly named. And when that pause ends or breaks, the next move happens fast. Step back from the individual events, the Air Force One interview, the summit photos at the Temple of Heaven, the IDF strike reports, the diplomatic meetings in Washington, and look at what is actually being constructed here. This is the architecture of a new great power negotiation over the Middle East, and it is being built in plain sight, piecemeal, through presidential statements and military actions, without a formal framework, without a signed agreement, without a UN resolution. That's not unprecedented, but it is fragile. The United States appears to have militarily degraded Iran's conventional forces and imposed a naval blockade that has effectively strangled Iran's economy. Trump says Iran's armed forces are essentially finished. Iran still has enriched uranium. Buried, yes, but present. And the question of what happens to that material is now the central, unresolved axis of the entire negotiation. Here is what makes the nuclear dust disclosure so strategically important. If Iran cannot physically remove its own enriched uranium stockpile without American or Chinese heavy machinery, then any final deal will require one of those two nations to physically enter Iranian territory and perform that extraction. That is a level of access, a level of presence that no Iranian government has historically been willing to grant. And yet, Tehran apparently floated it, then pulled back. What changed between the agreement and the reversal? Was there internal pressure from hardliners? Was it a negotiating tactic? Did someone in Tehran decide the offer was being taken too literally, too fast? We don't know. But the reversal is the most critical, unresolved question in this entire conflict right now. Meanwhile, China's positioning deserves careful attention. Xi Jinping has now publicly, at least to Trump, committed to withholding military equipment from Iran and expressed support for reopening the Strait of Hormuz. If those commitments hold, they remove two of Iran's most significant remaining sources of support. But commitments made privately to an American president are not the same as verified policy changes. Intelligence agencies will be watching Iranian ports, watching Chinese military logistics, watching whether the commitment shows up in behavior rather than words. And Lebanon is the wild card no one fully controls. Hezbollah operates with a degree of independence that Tehran itself does not fully direct at every operational level. Rocket attacks on Israeli territory from Hezbollah-held zones can escalate independent of whatever deal framework is being negotiated in Washington or Beijing. The IDF has made clear it will respond to those attacks. And each response risks pulling Lebanon deeper into a conflict that, at least formally, is centered on Iran. The diplomatic meetings between Israeli and Lebanese representatives in Washington on Friday are a signal that there is some appetite for a political track. But diplomacy and active rocket fire coexisting on the same news day illustrates exactly how thin the line is between a process moving forward and a process collapsing. What governments are watching right now, whether Iran re-engages on the nuclear material question, whether China's stated position translates into actual pressure on Tehran, whether the ceasefire holds past its current window, whether Hezbollah activity in Lebanon triggers a broader Israeli response, and whether Pakistan's mediation role opens a back channel that produces a surprise offer. What intelligence agencies are watching? The physical location and status of Iran's buried enriched uranium, Chinese military logistics movements toward or away from Iran, Hezbollah weapons resupply chains, and any internal political signaling inside Tehran about deal acceptance or rejection. This story is not moving toward a clean resolution. It is moving toward a series of decisions, each one high stakes, each one irreversible, and the next one could come any hour. The next 72 hours of this story may define the next year of Middle East stability. Iran has to decide whether it comes back to the table with real guarantees. China has to decide whether its offer of help translates into actual pressure on Tehran. And the ceasefire, which Trump himself didn't want, has to survive long enough for any of that to matter. What do you think happens next? Does Iran come back with a stronger offer, or does the military pressure resume? Drop your analysis in the comments. This community has called the turns of this story better than most pundits have. And subscribe now, because the next development in this conflict will not wait for a convenient news cycle.